A palace of marble, veined with gold, bathed in the perfume of crushed jasmine and rosewater. The air hangs thick, not with heat, but with reverence. Courtiers pass in silence. Sandals glide over polished stone. No one speaks above a whisper. Above the garden, on a second-floor terrace wrapped in silk drapes, a caliph peers downward. Below him, a garden said to rival paradise, vines curled like calligraphy, orchids rare enough to bankrupt kingdoms, roses that bloomed unnaturally red. Slaves worked the soil at dawn and dusk, veiled in white, hands blistered from iron tools and lye-washed water. But the secret wasn't the hands that planted the flowers, it was what fed them. Guards dragged her by the wrists, young, trembling, eyes darting toward the marble statues that lined the path. Each statue bore a face of serenity. No mouths open in scream, no eyes widened in terror. Only hers. She was thrown to the earth beneath the orchard's edge, beside the lilies still wet from morning dew. A small incision was made. Ritual, not slaughter. Not yet. The priest stood beside the gardener. Both nodded. Both blessed the act. Her blood ran along a shallow groove carved into the dirt, a crimson thread winding toward the roots. The soil accepted it greedily. And the petals? They glistened more brightly than the day before. This was not punishment. This was offering. Not to idols, but to the divine, to beauty, to empire. Inside the palace, the caliph inhaled the scent of the garden. He said nothing, but later that night, when his guests arrived, he gestured proudly toward the terrace view. Allah provides, he said, when man is not afraid to give. They laughed, they toasted, they marveled at the perfection of the flora, the precision of the courtyard's symmetry, the way even the nightingales sang as if trained. No one asked what fed the flowers. No one spoke of the girl. But the slaves knew. They passed it among themselves, a name never spoken, only whispered behind tapestries and under breath. The garden of the dying. Art was praised. Faith was invoked. The caliph's handwritten verse describing roses as Allah's silent witnesses was carved into the marble walls. Scholars wrote treatises on the theological justification of pain, of sacrifice, of beauty earned through obedience. And below it all, the roots thickened. A contradiction lived and breathed inside the palace walls, where the scent of sanctity masked the stench of suffering, and where silence wasn't peace. It was fear wrapped in silk. There, beauty thrived, because truth bled beneath it. They called him the mirror of mercy, but his mercy had teeth. The caliph sat on cushions embroidered with verses from the Quran. His robe dyed the color of crushed amethyst, his fingers stained with the ink of poems he wrote by lamplight. A man of letters, they said, a devout soul, a patron of the arts, a father to the faithful. He could recite scripture and quote Aristotle in the same breath. He wept when he heard the call to prayer echo across the dunes. He fasted twice as often as commanded. And yet, behind his throne stood men with hollow eyes, eunuchs stripped of their future and reshaped into silence. Beside his chambers, girls from every border of the empire, from the coasts of North Africa to the mountains of Armenia. Bought, taken, given as tribute, locked behind latticed walls too high to climb. His empire's beauty was unmatched. Mosaics shimmered like stars, mosques rose like the spires of paradise itself. But every tile, every arch, every carved verse was laid by chained hands. He called them servants of Allah's vision. They called themselves forgotten. At night, the caliph would walk the halls of his palace barefoot. humming verses of his own creation. "What is pain," he once wrote, "if not the fire that burns the sin from our souls?" His theology was precise, crafted not just by scholars but by necessity. In his eyes, every act of brutality was a ladder to holiness. Pain purified, suffering sanctified. Resistance was ego, and ego was the enemy of submission. He built schools. He burned books. He kissed children's foreheads after Friday prayer. He ordered boys' hands removed for stealing dates. Contradiction? No. He saw it as divine balance. "The right hand of justice must be dipped in perfume," he told his vizier. That way, the scent outlasts the sting. He surrounded himself with beauty, singing birds, fountains carved from jade, rare perfumes sent by vassal kings. His bed, it was said, was stuffed with the feathers of birds that had never touched the ground. He slept alone, except when the moon was full. Then a girl would be chosen. They say he never touched the same one twice. But even here, ritual ruled. Bathing in rose water, reciting verses of submission, swallowing droplets of saffron and honey before entering the room. And when morning came, she would leave without a word, replaced by another flower in the vase beside his bed. The Caliph prayed 5 times daily, and in every prayer he thanked God for beauty, for obedience, for blood kept quiet beneath the soil. His harem numbered in the thousands. Not concubines, not lovers, not women. Symbols. He saw them not as flesh, but as scripture in motion. Each body a verse, each scream a confession. They weren't chosen for their joy, but for how well they could suffer. "He does not take pleasure in pain," one ambassador wrote, "but in what pain produces: stillness, silence, surrender." And they did surrender. How could they not? To resist him was to resist God's vessel on earth. And he was adored by the people. They kissed the hems of his robe when he passed. They called his name during droughts. When his shadow fell across the marketplace, traders lowered their eyes in reverence. When he laughed, even enemies flinched. To the world, he was elegance made flesh, wisdom clothed in silk. But to those inside the palace, he was bone behind a curtain of roses, a hollow man whose God looked too much like his own reflection, a poet who wrote with perfume and sealed it in blood. The heat rose like steam off the cobblestones, thick with the scent of sweat, spices, and fear. In the city's oldest quarter, beneath banners embroidered with the words, "There is no God but God," the slave markets opened with prayer. Not for the slaves, no, for the buyers. May they be guided. May they find what pleases them. May their gold bless the faithful. Children arrived in silence, some wrapped in rags, others still wearing the embroidered sleeves of distant nobility. Their tongues spoke Armenian, Greek, Berber, Latin, languages no one bothered to translate, because they would learn, or be broken. One girl's anklet clinked when she walked. Her tribe believed it warded off evil. It did not stop the iron collar. The auctioneer stood on a raised platform, flanked by scholars who certified the captives' origins, health, and, most importantly, their obedience. They weren't sold as people. They were sold as temperaments. The quiet ones fetched higher bids. The loud ones were sold in bulk, bound together with rope soaked in vinegar to irritate their wounds. Branding was done behind a curtain, but the screams bled through the fabric like smoke. Some were given names on the spot: Yusuf, Layla, Tariq, Amina. Their old names were unspoken, their gods unwelcome. A conversion whispered in fear was enough to justify the hammer's fall. Some resisted. They bled. Most did not. The eunuchs were brought in at dawn. Boys between 8 and 13. No older, no younger. Just old enough to live, just young enough to forget. They were stripped, measured, inspected like livestock, then chosen, not by family, not by fate, but by surgeons with knives so sharp they didn't leave blood, only silence. The lucky ones died quickly. The rest lived long enough to serve. Some would guard the Caliph's treasury, others would stand beside the harem gates, but all would walk through life as echoes of the men they could have been. As for the women, they were catalogued: skin tone, breast size, hip width, teeth, but more than that, temper. Could she weep on command? Could she walk without sound? Did she kneel quickly enough? One scribe's ledger included this line: "Weepeth not, teeth too sharp, will bear pain but not children, reduce price." Those who bore children were given quarters within the palace grounds, but they were not wives. They were vessels, and when they birthed sons, they were briefly blessed. But if the child died, so did their value. Perfumed and powdered, they were paraded in front of veiled judges, men trained to spot rebellion by the twitch of an eye. "Buy not the pretty one who thinks," said a popular proverb. "Buy the quiet one who obeys." And the most obedient were never seen again. They entered through the eastern arch, the one with verses carved into ivory, and were taken to the Caliph's Rose Hall. No screams were ever heard from that chamber, not because they didn't scream, but because the walls were 30 palms thick. The Caliph's garden stretched for miles, a labyrinth of fountains, tiled mosaics, and roses that bloomed year-round, even in drought. Foreign dignitaries praised its symmetry, its fragrance, its divine tranquility. But no one ever asked what made the roses so red. Each bush had a name: loyalty, obedience, silence, faith. Each was fed with more than sunlight and water. There were stories whispered among the lowest servants, those who swept before dawn and vanished before the call to prayer. They spoke of what lay beneath the soil: bones wrapped in linen, fingers curled like roots, hair that had turned to threads tangled with worm trails. Slaves who disobeyed were not executed. They were offered. A final act of usefulness, the Caliph had said. Let them nourish beauty. Let them know they serve still. In the rose courtyard, certain spots were marked with small, uncarved stones. No prayers were said, no names recorded, just the soft rustle of petals above shallow graves. But it wasn't only death that fed the garden. Bloodletting was ritualized. On Fridays, selected slaves, usually women, young and pale, were summoned to the crimson tiles. A single cut to the inner thigh, controlled, ceremonial, done in the name of purification. The blood was collected in small gold bowls, stirred with crushed myrrh, and poured into the roots of the royal roses. One physician's account, later smuggled to Cairo, read, "The Caliph believes pain refines the soul, that in their screams God listens more closely. He watches as they bleed, as the roses bloom. I watch too, but I see only madness and petals too wet to touch." There were other rites too, less bloody but no less cruel. Slaves selected to serve in proximity to nobility were adjusted. A woman with too strong a scent was burned behind the ears with incense. One with too bright a voice had her tongue blunted with a file. A eunuch too tall had his spine compressed over weeks by being forced to kneel with weights across his shoulders. They called it refinement. They called it balance. The Caliph's aesthetic demanded symmetry, silence, and stillness, and anything that deviated was reshaped. Even beauty became a battlefield. Slave girls with unmatched eyes were tattooed with ash. Those with birthmarks had them scraped off with bone knives. The Caliph's principal consort, known only as the White One, had once shown signs of aging. She vanished for 40 days and returned veiled, silent, and smiling. No one ever saw her blink again. It wasn't merely cruelty, it was theology. Pain was the fire that burned away disobedience. Beauty was God's reward for silence. And the roses bloomed like open mouths, screaming in color where no one dared to speak. They weren't just whipped and silenced, they were stripped of language. In the Caliph's court, music flowed like wine. Flutes, lutes, recitations under moonlight. But no one mentioned where the songs came from. Many were composed by slaves, captives from Persia, Byzantium, even Sudan. Men and women once known as scholars, poets, court musicians in their own lands. Now reduced to instruments themselves, taught to please, not to speak. One hunchbacked eunuch called Asar had written verses so beautiful they were performed before the Caliph each week. Yet his name was never uttered. When he died, his writings were catalogued under anonymous. In one of the surviving manuals of harem discipline, an actual document studied centuries later, there's a passage on emotional compliance. Beneath instructions on posture and tone of voice is a poem scratched into the margins, barely legible. I wrapped my voice in honey, so it wouldn't sting their ears, but still, they beat the sweetness out and swallowed all my tears. There is no author, no signature, only a note beside it. Use for training. A girl from Samarkand once sang so clearly the court called her Night's Breath. But when she added a verse of her own one night, one that hinted at sorrow, at longing for her homeland, she vanished by morning. Her song was retained. Her name was not. Poetry was permitted only when it praised the Caliph, when it glorified obedience, when it made sorrow sound like gratitude. But the forbidden verses survived, carved under bedposts, sewn into linings of robes, whispered between breaths during forced ablutions. A record from a later scribe, likely sympathetic, catalogued fragments. He broke my legs, so I'd learn to bow without command. He sewed my mouth, so I'd smile with my eyes. I am not a woman, not a beast. I am a silence taught to dance. One slave was forced to sing while watching her brother's punishment. The melody was later adapted into a lullaby for the Caliph's son. No one ever told him what the original lyrics meant. This was more than physical torment. It was annihilation of self. Languages forbidden. Names replaced. Family erased. Entire cultures folded into soft melodies and perfumed bodies, bent to please and forgotten once broken. By the time the Caliph died, over 300 songs were preserved in the royal collection. None bore the names of their creators. But their pain echoes, even now, through the melodies of silence. In the heart of the Caliph's court, beneath domes inscribed with verses of mercy, a council of scholars met, not to restrain cruelty, but to codify it. They wore robes of white and green. They spoke with eloquence and scriptural authority, and with every ruling they gave, the whip grew heavier. One scholar, Imam Khalif ibn Ruwaid, became infamous for his fatwas. In a dusty compilation of religious verdicts still preserved in fragments, his writing appears with the heading, "On the Conduct Toward the Unruly Slave." He writes, "To strike a slave who resists is not merely permitted, it is to bring order to chaos. To take a woman's body without consent is not violation, for she is of his house. And if rebellion stirs within the tongue or the womb, let silence be sown by blade or fire." Khalif was not alone. In mosques across the empire, sermons thundered with interpretations that twisted faith into a weapon. The system needed holy men, not just soldiers, to justify the nightmare. One of the most horrifying rulings came during the reign of Caliph Umar II, long romanticized as a just ruler. A surviving parchment attributed to his court permits the removal of limbs from runaway males as divine deterrence, so long as it's done in stages, not unto death. This wasn't hidden, it was preached. Another legal opinion declared, if the master wounds the flesh but not the soul, it is no sin. But if he wounds with cruelty unbound, it is between him and God, not the courts. Even rape was systematized. A legal commentary by a renowned jurist in Damascus openly noted, a concubine has no right to deny her lord. Her resistance is immaterial. His rights are from heaven, not her will. In the margins of these texts, later readers scribbled notes, some in admiration, others in horror. One scribe, centuries later, added only one sentence in shaky calligraphy. We built paradise on bones and called it submission. But this was not merely law, it was ritualized. Before punishments, scholars would bless the instruments, the whip, the iron brand, the blade. Before taking a girl's virginity, a prayer was whispered, not for her, but to sanctify the act. And in some circles, castration was not just allowed, it was commended as an act of discipline for the sake of purity. This grotesque theology turned men of God into architects of pain. The scholar became the handmaiden of the tyrant, Scripture became the noose, and divine mercy was buried beneath ink and ash. As one freed captive later wrote, "They taught me the name of God, then used it to chain my tongue. They called my cries rebellion, and their silence righteousness." In the alleyways behind palace walls, there were whispers of tunnels beneath bathhouses, of guards bribed with stolen pearls, of girls who bound their breasts and painted fake mustaches just to taste a single night of air beyond the harem. Some of these stories ended in freedom, most did not. One girl, unnamed in the records but remembered in rumor, broke free by crawling through the corpse chute, where dead servants were dumped at dawn. She smeared herself in ash and rot to mask her scent from the hounds. A merchant claimed he saw her, weeks later, begging near the mosque in Aleppo, unable to speak, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Another tale, a eunuch named Rasim, who spent 13 years serving in the chamber of perfumes. By night, he studied poison, slow ones, bitter ones, those that left no mark. They say he dropped oil of black hellebore into the Caliphs' honeyed milk, not enough to kill, just enough to rot his teeth from the inside, make his gums bleed, his breath smell like death. Rasim was flayed alive, of course. His skin was hung at the garden gates as a warning, but the guards who carried out the punishment later wept at night, swearing his ghost drifted through the rose hedges. Others did not try to flee. They broke in place. A concubine named Safiya, after years of service, lost the ability to speak. Physicians said her tongue was uninjured, but she would only hum, a lullaby she learned from her mother who had died in the slave barracks. Her hands would trace the air, as if still brushing a child's hair. One former court physician, writing in secret after his exile, recalled an entire wing of the palace reserved for the broken. Girls who clawed at their faces, boys who chewed through their own tongues, servants who laughed when struck, wept when praised. There was a girl, he wrote, whose back had been burned in such a way that scar tissue formed the shape of the Bismillah. The calligraphers called it a miracle. She could not stand upright again. Even escape was no guarantee. A young slave named Qasim leapt from a palace balcony in Damascus, breaking his legs. The guards brought him back. Instead of killing him, the Caliph decreed he be left to crawl, a living lesson in futility. For years, Qasim dragged himself through the marble corridors, his knees calloused, his hands raw. Eventually, they made him a doorkeeper. They thought it poetic. And then there were the ones who disappeared. The fountains in the Caliph's garden were said to run strangely warm after certain nights. The groundskeepers said nothing. But once, a noblewoman from Al-Andalus, visiting with gifts of wine and honey, caught the scent near the jasmine beds. "What water is this?" she asked. "Rainwater," the gardener replied. She sniffed again. "Then why does it smell like iron?" No records exist of what happened to her after that. These weren't stories from a single palace. This was a world stitched together by horror, dressed in silk. Behind every veil was a scar. Behind every smile, a flinch. And the gardens, they bloomed always, as if fed by something richer than earth. They wrote poems about the Caliph's generosity. They painted miniatures of feasts, of scholars debating under golden arches. They carved entire histories in marble, histories that left no space for the screams. What they didn't write about were the girls buried upright beneath the orange trees, or the boys who bled into marble floors before their voices could deepen. And for centuries, that silence became truth. Today, textbooks speak of the golden age, of science, calligraphy, architecture. They mention libraries, not lashings. They praise tolerance, while the bones of the mutilated rest in unmarked graves beneath forgotten domes. Why? Because the victors weren't just conquerors. They were myth-makers. Because it's easier to celebrate the perfume than to ask where the scent came from. Because historians, fearing accusations of bigotry or Islamophobia, often sanitize what was, and in doing so, betray those who suffered. You are not taught that eunuchs were disemboweled without anesthesia. You are not told that slave girls as young as 6 were handed over to men as gifts of loyalty. You do not read about how poets had their tongues nailed to wood for writing love songs to the wrong gender. You don't learn about the slave who ran, barefoot, for 12 hours through the Zagros Mountains, only to be returned by a shepherd who received a silver coin for his loyalty. And no one mentions what was done to her afterward. Instead, you hear that slavery was a norm of the time, or less brutal than Western practices. As if branding is gentle when done under a crescent moon. As if a harem is harmless when painted in pastel. We condemn the Atlantic slave trade, as we should. We name the captains, we study the ships, we show the chains. But here, we hide the names. We call it concubinage. We call them servants. And if you ask why, they tell you, it's sensitive, it's complicated. It's not the full picture. But when history hides the blade, it sharpens it for the future. Because silence isn't neutrality, it's complicity. And when you erase the wounds of millions to protect the pride of a few, you aren't preserving culture. You're burying corpses with flower petals and calling it mercy. There are scholars today who know, who've read the travelogues, the court orders, the fatwas written in ink and blood. But they won't speak. Because to speak is to be labeled. Because to write the truth is to be erased yourself. So the cycle continues. The textbooks close. The statues stand. The perfume lingers. And the truth, rotting, unmarked, waits beneath the garden. She was promised a job in Dubai. A maid's salary, a room of her own, money to send home. She kissed her children goodbye in Lagos and boarded the plane with hope. 3 weeks later, she hadn't touched money. Her passport was gone. Cameras watched her sleep. Her employer beat her when she broke a glass. She hadn't seen the sun in 12 days. This isn't 800 AD. This is 2023. Modern slavery is not a relic of the past. It thrives in its shadow. According to the Global Slavery Index, over 50 million people are currently trapped in modern slavery. A significant percentage exist in Islamic majority nations where kafala systems, legal loopholes, and silence make exploitation invisible and nearly impossible to escape. In Saudi Arabia, migrant workers are legally tied to their employers, unable to leave the country without permission. If you run, you're a criminal. If you're raped, you're blamed. If you die, your body is sometimes returned, unpaid, unnamed. In Mauritania, slavery was officially abolished in 1981, but ask around quietly, and you'll find families still owning other families, passing them down like heirlooms. Dark-skinned Haratan people serve lighter-skinned Moors, washing their clothes, tending their herds, raising their children. And what of Qatar? The world saw the stadiums. But did they see the bodies buried beneath them? Reports estimate that over 6,000 migrant workers died in the lead-up to the 2022 World Cup. Many were from South Asia, promised opportunity, delivered into servitude. Some lived 10 to a room, some were beaten for speaking out, some never made it home. But they smiled for the cameras. They clapped for the emir. They waved flags for a freedom they were never given. And what about the women? They're still trafficked from East Africa, Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, sold into marriages or forced into brothels in Dubai, Jeddah, Tripoli. A 14-year-old girl from Ethiopia was recently found chained in a bathroom in Kuwait. She had been there for 9 months. Her crime? Disrespect. Her owner, a well-known businessman. No charges were filed. This is not about Islam. This is about impunity hiding behind sacred symbols. This is about systems that preserve power, not faith. This is about how yesterday's theology can become today's cage. We like to believe history moves forward, that we learn, that we evolve. But the chains are still forged. The brands are still hot. The perfumes still mask the stench. When a prince in Abu Dhabi can imprison his daughter for trying to leave the country, when a domestic worker is thrown from a balcony and the death is ruled accidental, when entire governments still use religious rhetoric to justify labor camps, we must ask ourselves, have we truly changed, or have we just changed the words? Concubine becomes sponsored spouse. Slave becomes housemaid. Torture becomes discipline. And the world keeps spinning, on carpets woven by the unpaid, beneath chandeliers cleaned by the invisible. The echoes remain, and if we don't name them, they become the future's silence. The room is quiet, cool, air-conditioned. Clean, white walls cradle glass cases filled with gold, silk, and weapons that once drank blood. The plaque reads, Umayyad era, 8th century, Damascus. A scholar adjusts his glasses. He's reading a fragment of a poem, brittle parchment, faded ink. It was written by a concubine. Her name lost, her verses misattributed for centuries to a man. The translation reads, I bent like the willow for your praise, but roots grow best in unbroken soil. You plucked me for your pleasure. Now I wither beneath your garden's shadow. He clears his throat. Behind him, a group of schoolchildren pass by, laughing. None of them stop. The camera moves slowly, from the text to the exhibits. Perfume flasks made of bone. Chains labeled as decorative jewelry. A eunuch's robe, still stained at the collar. And finally, a garden painting, once a court mural. Birds sing, roses bloom, lovers walk under arches. It's beautiful, but beneath the paint, X-ray scans have revealed a different layer. Skulls, bones, burial pits. The mural was altered centuries ago, covered up, whitewashed. The flowers were never innocent, they were fed. And somewhere still, in the back alleys of Riyadh, in the suburbs of Tripoli, in the tower apartments of Dubai, the garden grows. It does not ask for rain. It does not need sun. It drinks silence, and it thrives.